fingerprint. And we have two of the descendants of the parishes here in our audience today, Jim and Tom Larrick. So it's an honor for them to be here too. And I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you. And it's nice to be home. I miss Lamar.
Where are you living, Doc?
Casa Grande, Arizona, where mom and dad moved to about 28 or 9. And no, actually it was 1996, I think, when they moved down there. And when mom died in 2015, Ava and I moved down there to help her, but since she didn't last very long, we went ahead and decided to buy the house, and that's where we stayed. And now my son-in-law, Donald, and my oldest daughter, Kate, live with us. So it's really handy. I have a live-in handyman, and so he helps keep the house in shape. He also helps with the pool in the community, and he also helps some of the widows around the community who we've probably got at least half a dozen to 8 families who the women have lost their husbands, and so they're still living there. And we've gone through quite a changeover in that community in the last 3 years. There hadn't been a sale in there for, I think, 5 years before we got there. And now more than half of the houses have been sold and we have new people. So yeah, it's a little community of 65 homes that actually was built about 35 years ago. So it's really kind of an interesting process. And it's kind of an interesting place. And yeah, it's hot and it's dry, but I come home and you guys got to make sure I have 90-degree temperatures at least. So that can't be, I want to remind you, well, that's all right. They gave me 90 degrees when I was in Minnesota with Dave this last couple of weeks. So everybody, it's been kind of fun. This program got started because this is the 90th anniversary of 2 things that happened in 1929. One of those was the opening of the Prioras County building, and it's an amazing facility. It was actually dedicated on August 1st of 1929. And 2 of the first several major trials were the Fleagle trials. And so we're going to go through and examine, at least partially, as quickly as I can and as succinctly as I can, how we got to where we are and what went on. We'll have questions at the end, and I'm sure I won't be able to answer them all. As we all know, the First National Bank of Lamar in 1928 was on the northwest corner of Main and Olive. Caddy corner from there was the Valley State Bank. We're talking about May. In March of that year, there was a rumor that there was going to be a robbery of a bank in Lamar. And so the bankers in Lamar got together and decided they would have extra guards around. Well, they had extra guards until about the first week of May. And they said, well, we're not going to get a robbery, so they took away all the guards. Meanwhile, on May 23rd, 1928, 4 guys walked into the First National Bank a little after 1 o'clock. They waited until Senior Parish had gotten into the bank, and they went over and said, stick them up. This is an Argus rendering, which is not even close. But it gets the point across. They said, stick them up. Amos Newton Parrish, president, ducked back from right where he was talking to his son into the back of his office, grabbed up his old 45, which he called Betsy, and one of the guys was supposed to take care of the old man. And so then the other one of them stood by the front door, as a guard, and the other two, one of them went to where Jado Parrish was sitting, and the other one went to the first teller window. And when Amos Newton came to the door with his gun, one of the robbers is a tall guy standing there in front of him. Newton Parrish shot him in the jaw. And the robber took his .44 and shot Amos in the head. And he fell back. Amos's gun misfired a second time. His third shot went into the ceiling over on the other side of the building. The guy standing by the door had his pistol out, and he fired his whole 6-shot through the glass of the president's office. Now, we think it was a .38, and I think 90 years ago, they didn't get as deep into forensics as we do today. So there's not a lot of question, there's a lot of detail about what shot went where and who did what. But some of the shots that the guy at the front door shot, because he had to reload his gun, went through the glass and busted it, and actually went through the wall. And there are still at least 2 or 3 bullet holes on the back side of the closet in the old corner pharmacy. And so then Jado got up from his chair and turned around and headed back to a closet where there was guns and a phone. And one of them shot him in the back, and it went right straight to his heart, and he fell dead. Meanwhile, the fourth one had grabbed one of the customers and thrown him to the ground, so he'd be out of range of any shots and wouldn't get hurt. Besides, he didn't want to get shot himself. So then one of them hollered, "Get the rifles." So they opened the back door around the back side of the teller's windows, and he went out and got 2 rifles out of the car, which was sitting outside the back door. The guy who had been shot didn't fall down. He actually had a pillowcase, and he went around behind, and he took all the cash out of the teller's drawers and put it in the pillowcase, and he picked up the guns that were in the drawers of a couple of the tellers. The other one grabbed a teller and took him back to the vault and said, "Show me the money." So he's in the back getting the money. The other guy brings in the rifle, so there's now a guy with a rifle in the front corner at the window at the door. And the other one's picking up the money, and they come back out, and the plan had been to take Jado Parrish as a hostage. Well, that wasn't going to work because he was dead. So they took teller E.A. Kessinger, and someone said something to him, "What are you going to take him for?" And that was Lundgren, and Lundgren was a one-armed guy. And they picked him up and carried him out too. So they had 2 guys, they threw him in the car. Some of the people there were a couple of offices back behind the bank, stuck their heads out and got told real quick with a gun aimed at their head to get back in. They got in the car and took off down the street. They were in the bank no more than about 8 minutes. Meantime, the guy in this Valley State Bank called the sheriff and said, "You needed it at the First National Bank." And the sheriff was having lunch. And he hopped in his car. Good boy. And came down to the bank, and there's guys running out of the bank. One of them runs up the car and says, "The bank's been robbed and the president's killed." Well, Alderman says, "Well, get in the car and we'll go after him." The guy turns around and runs up the street. So then Harry Anderson, who was one of the customers in the bank, came out and said the same thing. And so Alderman said, "Well, get in the car and we'll go after him." And he did. And so they took off. Well, the robbers were not too lucky, because there was a train across the 5th Street crossing and Main Street. So they had to go all the way to 8th Street to cross to go north. And meantime, Alderman comes around the corner, the train has moved, so he can start right up Main Street. They seize the blue car that they're chasing, going around the curve out north of town, and as going across the bridge. Of course, at that time, it was a different bridge. But so there, he's fallen, and they go out to about where the old Elks Country Golf Club was, turned up the road there, and stopped and dropped Lundgren out there. So Alderman and Anderson come up behind and see this guy, and they slow down. Wait a minute. They figure out it's Lundgren, and they say, well, just tell them we're chasing them, and they go on up the road. So they go back, and it comes clear back around the top of Lamar and over to about Road 13. And they came down, and just out there, if you go out by there, there's a telephone tower, Old Mountain Bell AT&T tower. And just out about there is a road that goes off to the east. It goes down the hill and goes across Sand Creek. Well, they went across Sand Creek and stopped. And Alderman pulls up on the hill on the west side and realizes when they cleaned his car, they put the shotgun back in, but not the rifle. So all he's got is a pistol and a shotgun, and these guys are on the other side of Sand Creek with rifles. And so he and Anderson duck for cover as two of the guys from the car bring out their rifles and start shooting at the sheriff's car. They semi-disable the car and then get in theirs and take off down the road and disappear. They went past the Parrish Ranch and clear over and up through Bristol and went up to the State Line Road and then went east and then went north and east again until they got to their hideout. But of course, we didn't know who the hideout was at that time. So, in the meantime, there was no police chief in Lamar. So, they opened the armory and started handing out guns to anybody who wanted to be on a posse. And there were posses all over this country. And they would stop cars and they, at gunpoint. And there are quite a few funny stories about people. And for some reason, blue cars seemed to be very popular in 1928. So anybody with a blue car was suspect. And there were even several of the guys who were in the posses had blue Buicks. And so to try to keep them separate, they would put sheets on the top of the car. And in one case, the sheet blew off, and the guy got surrounded because they thought he was the robber's car. And because they went north, and there was a story about them going through Sheridan Lake, and then of course there was a story about them showing up and going down to Oklahoma, and so there was just spread out all over the place. But one of the things was that Sheriff Alderman talked to Chief Richardson of Garden City. So here's one of the things that I ran into in doing research of the people back then, and it's not quite as true today, but in the old days, newspapers and other places that published, because you were doing it with lead type, and it was cost for every letter that you had to put in that lead type, you abbreviated. So everybody became A.N. Parrish, or A.F. Hollenbeck, or C. Gordon, or A.C. Gordon. And I mean, and I'm going, all right, who in the heck is A.F. Hollenbeck? We'll get to him. But that was what happened with A.N. Parrish. He always showed up as A.N. Parrish instead of Amos Newton. Alderman called Richardson, and this is a copy. This is the car that's out at the museum. Can't substantiate that it was ever really the bank robbery car. The crazy thing is the Fleagles love Buicks, and particularly blue Buicks. We didn't know who the guys were at the time, but one of them liked Fords, the other one liked Buicks, and so they used, most of the time they used Buicks in the robberies. There are at least half a dozen robbery stories that deal with the Fleagles where they used a blue Buick, took it out, and blew it up. Now, the key was that later on, there's a Ford that shows up in California, and then another Buick shows up when one of them gets arrested. So that's the Buick that theoretically Alderman bought at the end of the process. Because of what was going on, the Colorado Bankers Association got involved, and they asked Chief Harper from Colorado Springs to assist Alderman in the investigation. And so they paid for him to come down, and he had one of his deputies come down, and so that they would try to figure out what was going on. The Fleagles had been smart enough, they bought an old Buick out of a junkyard in Pueblo. It wouldn't run, but they got it licensed somehow. So they had a real license plate for a Buick that they put on their car driving around. And of course, that didn't last long after the robbery. They changed license plates again. And they figured out pretty quickly that that was a false license plate. So, and Harper said he figured that was probably not going to be a good clue. Richardson, out of Colorado, out of Garden City, was talking to Alderman, and one of the things that happened within 24 hours of the robbery is that a lady doctor's wife from Dighton, Kansas, called Garden City looking for her husband. Because three guys had come by the house and told him that they needed him to come out to a farm where there'd been an accident and a person had gotten hurt. And so he left with them, but they were driving in an open touring car, and he didn't like that. So they turned around, went back, and got his blue Buick and drove out. One of them got in the back seat, one of them got in the front seat with the doctor, and away they went, and the other one, of course, was driving the touring car behind them. So they went out to the hideout, and so all of a sudden now, she's calling because the doctor didn't come home, and he didn't call, and she's worried. One of the other things that happened at the same time, just after the robbery, was there was a call to Denver, and one of those calls was made by Fred Betz Sr. to ask for a National Guard airplane to fly over the area looking for the robber's car. And so that plane was put in the air. Alderman and Richardson, when they figured out, they thought that because the doctor was missing, that could tie to the wounded robber. So they sent him, and Alderman got in a plane, and he's flying around. There's another plane shows up from Denver, and another plane shows up from Lake in Kansas. So there were lots of planes flying around, and they were looking for what they found north of Scott City. The next day was the doctor's car shoved off the side of the road. As Alderman and his flight guy are landing in the field next to this area, they see an open touring car drive away. That was the robbers. But nobody was looking for an open touring car, so they didn't have an idea that was a new car. So they found the doctor's body, and they found the car. And Richardson said, "Don't let anybody get to the car. I've got a fingerprint expert, and let's see if he can find a fingerprint on the car that'll help us identify who these people are." He did. He found a fingerprint on that back window. And what it turned out was the back window was one of those that was difficult to get it to go up and down. So you had to put your finger on it to bring it up. they wiped everything off that they knew of, but the fingerprint was up in the edge. And so when they rolled the window up, it didn't wipe the fingerprint off. So now you had a fingerprint. You got a dead doctor, now you've got 3 dead people. And Kessinger's still missing. Roland Terwilliger is the guy who found the fingerprint. At that time, the FBI had just been collecting fingerprints since about 1902. Most of those were people who were already in prison or had been incarcerated from then till that time. But their key was, the FBI at that time said you had to have all 10 fingers to be able to identify that person for sure. Well, Terwilliger was talking, they had an amateur fingerprint convention in Denver. And Terwilliger took copies of that fingerprint up there and handed them out to the FBI guys and said, I believe if you memorize those whoops and swirls in that fingerprint, you will be able to identify that guy when it comes across in front of you. So they said, well, we'll give it a try. So they took cards back to Washington and handed them out to the people in the various fingerprint divisions. Then a few weeks later, down by Elkhart, Kessinger's body was found. And so now you got 4 dead people. Meanwhile, you got people going all over this country trying to arrest people. To fill, who were these? First of all, the question was, how were there 4? Was there 5? Was there 1 in the car? And of course, when you got down to it, they didn't know. But what they started doing was they started arresting what they thought was the normal, typical guys who fit the bill. In a year, they arrested 58 different men across the country. And they actually held Floyd Jarrett was arrested in September of 28. Oliver was arrested in the first, late 28. And then Walker and Fred Nava were arrested in January 29. They were all in jail around either in Lamar, or sometimes they took them to Pueblo, sometimes they had them in Wiley, sometimes they had them in Los Animas. So they're sitting in jail here, and of course the DA and everybody's going, well, and so they start talking about, we're going to try them, we're going to try them. They have a problem. They have a problem. None of them match the fingerprint. So they're going, we think we got the guys. We think we got them. They had eyewitness testimony saying, yeah, that's one of the guys. On every one of these, they had at least 1 to 2 people identify him as one of the robbers from the First National Bank. Eyewitness testimony. In March 1929, a man called himself William Holden got arrested in California because the car he was driving wasn't his and wasn't registered to who he said it was. So they took him in and they fingerprinted him and photographed him, and so, but they didn't. And the guy said, send them to Washington. Send those fingerprints to Washington. Well, they sent him to Sacramento, and eventually they got sent to Washington. But by then, Holden and his buddy and his girlfriend had been released, and so they were gone. What got them originally questioned was that they rented a house that was actually owned by a Stockton police officer. And it was his father-in-law, who lived next door, who was keeping an eye on the house. And he saw some strange comings and goings, and they were doing some weird timing things, and saw what he thought were guns being hauled in and out of the car and in the house. And so that's what got the 2 police officers out to that house, that got them started on the process to identifying who William Holden was. And Holden, the FBI identified because his fingerprints were on file in Washington from when he had been arrested and imprisoned in Oklahoma for a year for a robbery around Christmas time, about, I think it was like 1918, 1919, and he got like $12.50 in the robbery and spent a year in prison. But his fingerprints were on file. And so now you've got identification. And they sent it to Alderman, and they sent it to Richardson. And they say, we know this guy because his family lives just outside of town. Actually about 9 miles north of Holcomb, which is, of course, the scene of the infamous Truman Capote in cold blood that came a lot many years later. But so they had been involved, they had been tied also with that fingerprint to a robbery of a mail train in California. In 1929, 1928, two things you didn't have. You did not have a federal statute about robbery of banks. It was all state. And you did not have a federal investigation system, but you did have postal inspectors. So because it was a mail train in California, they were able to bring in postal inspectors, and they put a watch on the Fleagle mail in Garden City. And out of that, they got a tip that sent Alderman by airplane to Illinois, into Kankakee, Illinois, where, according to the deal, Mr. Fleagle was going to show up at the post office asking for mail under an assumed name. He did. He didn't. They didn't have any for him, but he walked. So someone followed him all the way to a bank where he was turning in Liberty bonds, not from the Lamar robbery, but from another one. And he was arrested right outside the bank. And the other thing that got out of that was they had a tip. Once they got Ralph, they had a tip that his brother was staying in a house in Peoria, and that he was going to call later. So Alderman said, okay, and Peoria is across the state from Kankakee. And so it was going to take Alderman a while to get there. So they called the Peoria Police Department, who sent out 2 policemen in an unmarked car that everybody in town knew was an unmarked police car. Jeez, I remember that. So you got Ralph, they go to arrest Jake, and as the 2 police officers are walking up the driveway, a blue Buick pulls in the driveway behind them. And they turn around, and the guy in the car says, oh crap. And so he backs out and starts down the street. The 2 police officers turn around, they park their car a couple blocks away. So they flag down a guy in a car and give chase. What they didn't know was Jake was sitting on the screen porch. So Jake gets up, doesn't go back in the house, just gets up, goes across the street to a guy who's got a telephone, calls an attorney friend and says, you're going to be needed downtown because Mr. Moss has been arrested. And he hangs up and he walks out the street and he disappears. So much for Jake. Well, now you've got, the interesting thing is that Ralph, because he wanted to clear things up, was willing to pay his own way by air back to Garden City. And they then drove him from Garden City to Lamar, where he was fingerprinted and photographed. And they took him to Colorado Springs, where Hugh Harper was. And so now they put together an interrogation team to try to break Ralph and to get the story of the robbery. In part of that, they also went out and arrested Ralph's 2 other brothers, Fred and Walter. And they arrested Jake Sr. They took Walter and Fred to Colorado Springs. They kept Jake Sr. in Garden City. So now they've gone these and they're telling Ralph that they're gonna go ahead and try these guys, and they're also gonna try his two brothers, and even maybe his father as an accessory. And so Ralph's going, well, you know, and so he says, I heard about this Cunningham, who was a retired appellate court judge. And so Harper says, well, I know he's a strict guy. So he goes out and he gets Cunningham to come in and talk to Ralph. And he tells Ralph, he said, I won't represent you unless you're telling the truth and you did, you know, and you come clean. And I'll try to make a deal that they won't hang you. So he talks to Ralph, and finally he thinks he's got an agreement. So then they get all of the people, and includes attorneys from Kansas involving the doctor and the other killing that was in Kansas, although it was someone from Lamar. And they have about 13 different people in a room representing Colorado's Attorney General, Prowers County, the Bankers Association, and you know, I mean, they've got all kinds of law enforcement people and attorneys, and they're all saying, we got to get this story straight and we got to get the answer. So the deal was that that they would not hang Ralph, but give him life imprisonment if he told the truth about the whole story and identified who else was with him in the robbery. So they all theoretically agreed to that at the time. Now at the time, there was a different attorney, district attorney when the original deal was made. And so then later they changed their mind. But Cunningham said, okay, here's the deal, and they all said yes. And they all stood in front of Ralph and said, yes, we'll do this, this is what we're going to do. It still took Harper and his two interrogation cohorts 13 hours to get the story out of Ralph. And at first, Ralph started out telling him a wives' tale, and Harper said, "No, wait a minute, Ralph." He said, "I told you that you only got one shot. And if you don't do this right, we're going to go back and we're going to charge everybody." So Ralph finally says, "Okay." And he said, "Well, who was with you?" "Well, Jake." And you're going, "We know Jake was there. We got his fingerprint." "Okay, who else was it?" "Well," Sonny says it was Heavy Royston and George Abshire. And they're looking, who? And they're going, "None of the guys we've got in jail?" "Nope, none of them." And one of the interrogators looked at him and said, you were going to let them take the rap for you?" Ralph goes, "Yeah." District Attorney Malcolm Erickson, the guy that said he would do the deal to not hang Ralph. But then what he also said was that it would be up to a jury. There are some interesting questions of legality that got into this later. Abshire was arrested in Grand Junction, Colorado. And Royston was arrested in San Andreas, California, where he lived. They were both brought to Colorado Springs, and when they were arrested, they were shown the Ralph's confession. And so they knew that the jig was up and that they had been found out. In August 1st of 1929, they dedicated the Prowers County Courthouse, which I thought was fascinating, basically because it was built in this county without a bond issue. The county commissioners had started putting money away about 1919 and had saved up and transferred from keeping within the budgets, the money into a fund for building, to the point that when they got to 1928, they could contract with a designer to build the building that they dedicated on August 1st of 1929. It was fascinating. I was talking to Barbara McDaniel, who's the district court lady, and she was noting, because I wanted to get pictures of the courtroom, and I thought we'd do this in the courtroom today. But with the new electronic processes you've got, you can't do that. So that's why we're here. It would have been a lot more fun to do it in the courtroom. But you can't do it that way. On the north door is a plaque that I had never even noticed in the long years I've lived here. That says, "Honor to citizens who build and house to better our government." And 90 years that building has done an excellent job for this county. And I'm proud to say that I lived in Prowers County and think that is a wonderful building. And it's great. The flagpole out on the north side has the list of all the men from here who served in World War I. And then, of course, the plaques that were added later show those who died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and I think Vietnam. The courtroom is on the 3rd floor. So we're now in August, and you're getting ready for the trials. You got 3 guys you're going to put on trial. The other ones who were still in jail, they got transferred to other states where they were wanted. Texas and Oklahoma, and I think one of them actually went to Nebraska. And all 3 of them ended up in prison for a number of years for other crimes and not involving Lamar. The district courtroom today looks a lot like it did back then, although technology has had its effect. You have TV screens, you have microphones, you have, television and other things in there that you didn't have 90 years ago. But the basic positions of the desks and the seating are still the same. Those are district judge pictures on the back wall, and the 2 other ones back there are a listing by name of all the brands that are in the courthouse, that are in the walls, on the 1st floor and in the courtroom. All right. I hate it when that does that to me. I just checked it yesterday, it was fine. Here's the love, they just redid a couple years ago, the artwork on the ceiling, and you can see along the bottom there, the brands that are etched all around the courtroom. I at one time thought that the brand people would help pay for the courthouse. No. It was just something that they decided it was a good thing to do, was to honor all the cattlemen who had been part of Prowers County. Barbara McDaniel told me she got all but 2 brands that they could identify. And what those were brands that brought cattle through that had to be registered and sold, that were sold here in Prowers County in all those years. Amos French Hollenbeck. He was the 3rd district judge at the time of the trials. Kind of an interesting little guy. He was born in 1854 in Pennsylvania. He taught school back there from 1877 to 78, and then became a superintendent of schools until 1881. Studied for law. Back in those days, you could study without actually going to a law school and take the test and become a lawyer. And he did. He joined the bar in Pennsylvania in 1882. Well, he decided Pennsylvania wasn't where he wanted to stay, so he moved to Trinidad, Colorado. And he opened a law practice in Trinidad. And when you go into the into the state records of the Bar Association, and you put in A.F. Hollenbeck, you find out that he was registered as part of the Colorado Bar through Backett County, July 9th, 1889. He then became elected district judge in 1918, and he served for 19 years. So that's why he was the judge for the Fleagle trials. He died in 1937. Just before the trials, the Denver Post had been a big part of drumming up the history and making sure that people were going to remember these guys and wanted to make sure they got hung. Of course, the Denver Post had also said in the early days they would put up $1,000 a head reward money for those who were caught and convicted in the robbery of the Lamar Bank. So they figured they had a stake. And so they would drum up all the time what was going on. Just before the trial, Ralph had already confessed, but they then had Abshire and Royston also confess, and they had confessions taken down in the courthouse here in Prowers County. So they were registered confessions. Think about it, the Denver Post somehow got a hold of all those confessions, and they printed them word for word on the front page. Somehow they ended up on the front page of the Lamar Daily News too. Prowers County was getting involved, and so they reached out to Arthur Gordon. And of course, you know, Arthur C. Gordon's offices were right above the bank. He was a real good friend of the Parrish's, and he was also Mrs. Parrish's attorney and the bank's attorney. He ended up with the desk. You see behind him was Newton's desk, and he ended up giving it out to the museum, where he is now visible. I lived next to Mr. Gordon from when I was in 3rd grade until he died, over on 2nd Street. Young kid, I didn't think about talking to him about the bank robbery or any of that time at that time. I wish now, of course, that I had, but we never got into that kind of a discussion. I did a few things for him around the house, but not much. But Prowers County decided that they ought to have not just the district attorney and his assistant, but some special prosecutors. So they had Arthur C. Gordon and Granby Hilliard were hired as special prosecutors and paid $500 no matter what it took or how long it took or whatever they had to do. That was the price. I find Granby Hilliard and Gordon very interesting guys. You know where Granby, Colorado is? That was named after Granby Hilliard. He was the Colorado U.S. attorney at the time a company wants to have a city laid out over there northwest of Denver. And so I don't guess they liked the idea of calling it the city of Hilliard, but Granby stuck, so it's still known as Granby today. And their Chamber of Commerce and stuff list him as the guy that the city's named after. Granby was born in 1875, died in 1942. He and Arthur Gordon was born in 1884. He died in 1965. The interesting thing about them is they were brother-in-laws. They tie in another Lamar family, the Crays. Gordon married Cray's youngest daughter, Lola, in 1916. Hilliard married Cray's oldest daughter, Anna, in 1900. At the time of the Lamar robberies, Hilliard was actually practicing in Denver, but he was going to come down for the trials specifically. And just before the trials were opened, all of a sudden, there's a story in the Denver Post about Granby Hilliard being involved in a shooting in Denver and actually getting wounded in the arm. And the story never really got cleared up, but there was a woman involved that was not his wife, and that's Randy. Now the other one, the other Cray who shows up in the story is Madge. She was Cole, the Deputy District Attorney's secretary, who took the confessions and then read the confessions into the record in the trials. This is Deputy DA Alan Cole. He turns out to be an interesting guy because he loved to drive around with the police. And I guess he got into several hot troubles and problems while he was doing that. They've got a file on him out of the the trials were set to begin on September 29, actually September 30th, which is the day after the crash in Wall Street. This is the courtroom, and you can see this is Abshire's trial. It's just getting ready to start. But at the beginning of the trial, Mr. Cunningham gets up and says, I can no longer represent Royston and Abshire because I don't think they have the same concerns as my main person, Ralph Fleagle. So all of a sudden, you're stuck there, and Alan Hallenbeck says, okay. So he said, I got it. I'm going to name Byron Rogers from Los Animas as the attorney to represent Royston and Abshire. And so Byron Rogers says, okay. He asks for time. He says, how am I got to have, at least 2 weeks just to be able to look. They've got a list of 70 witnesses. I have no idea what we're doing here. And Hallenbeck says, this is on a Tuesday. You got till Friday, and we're going to start the trial the next Monday. You can file any motions you want by Friday, but the trial starts on Monday. Byron Rogers, he files the motions for change of venue, for changing their guilty pleas to not guilty, and to have the confession suppressed, and all those nice legal terms. And Hallenbeck says, no problem. And Rogers says, but you got all this publicity from all the people around here. There's not going to be able to get a good, honest jury here. And Hallenbeck says, no, that's my job. I'll make sure we have a good jury. And since they've all confessed, I don't have a problem. So Byron Rogers turns out to be quite a character. He went on, he was born in Texas in 1902. He served in the Army in World War I. Went to CU in 1923. He got his degree from DU in 1925 and opened his practice in Los Animas. After his being the attorney for the two Fleagle gang guys, got him some attention. He was elected to the Colorado House in 1932 and served till 1935. He was the Speaker of the House in 1933. He was the Attorney General in 1936 to 41. In 1951, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he served for 20 years. He died December 31, 1983. And the Denver Federal Courthouse in 1984 was named for Byron Rogers because he helped, when he was in Congress, help get the money to make that, get that courthouse built. That's where the Oklahoma bomber trial was moved, was held there. And it's still the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. I had the privilege of getting to have lunch with Byron Rogers in Denver Press Club one time, back about 1980. And we had a nice lunch, and we talked about and he always said, the key to my whole career was being named the attorney for for Abshire and Royston. He said, gave him the name recognition that he started out with, and it gave him the opportunity to move forward. They put Abshire on trial first. Now we're looking at October 9th. And the key, Roger says, why don't you do Fleagle first? He's the one that you captured. He's the one that you made the deal with. And Erickson says, no, we get our own choice about how we want to do these trials. So we're going to put Abshire on trial first. And if they think they can get him get a guilty verdict and a death sentence out of them, because remember, Abshire didn't fire a single shot in the bank. So technically, as far as they know, he didn't kill anybody. Now we do know that he shot at the sheriff's car with a rifle out at Sand Creek, but he didn't hit anybody there either, just a spark plug or two. So they bring him in, and one of the things they did was they brought in all the guns that they had picked up in all the arrests and all the things that they had from each one of the different guys. And it was funny, I think back then it was easier to get a camera in the courtroom than it is today, because they got a picture of the Abshire's jury. And we think that we have searching today. They searched them going into these guys too. They didn't want anybody screwing around, because they wanted to make sure they got this done right. So they searched. I thought it was interesting. You got the picture that they got is them searching a guy and a woman standing in the line. I'm wondering who did her search. For Abshire, they brought in witnesses were Harry Anderson, who was the customer in the bank at the time, who was with the sheriff when they were chasing him around. Vivian Potter was the secretary in the bank, and Myrtle Garrett was the number one teller. No, number two, because her husband was number one. And while she was, all of them were laying on the ground, Royston comes around with his pillowcase and he's dripping blood. And one of the things they showed as evidence in the trial was Myrtle's blood-stained dress. But they all told the same basic story, and they all weren't sure that Abshire was one of the guys in the bank. But, so then they brought Fred Fleagle in, which was another fun story. He is, I don't know how to describe how you deal with Fred Fleagle, but even the judge, Hallenbach, was having trouble getting Fred to say much, and Fred said, "Well, I've got a cough," and and he mumbled, and so after about 5 questions about where he was and the bank, and then they knew about the ranch at Marienthal and the hideout, and he was trying. So Rogers then wanted to see if he could tie Ralph to the bank, to the ranch, and that he could show that it was Ralph who was the orchestrated the whole thing. And Erickson objected, and Hallenbach ruled that it was immaterial. In I think it was about 1970. I don't remember when the museum was first given the Buick. Skip Gibson was the city attorney at the Daily News, and somebody at a place up in Nebraska was claiming they had the Fleagle getaway car, and we're going, no, I don't think so. And so Gibson and I got on the phone and discovered that Fred Fleagle was living at the Fleagle residence north of Holcomb. So we called him on the phone, and we couldn't get much out of it either, except what he did, he was sure that what they were driving was a blue Buick. So that was, because the car that they've got in Nebraska is not a blue Buick. it does turn out to have been owned by the Fleagle family. And there is a document that shows that the Fleagles gave the people in, I think it's in Minturn, Nebraska, in that huge car thing up there, this car that was a Fleagle car, but not a Blue Buick. So, so there you got Cole and Rogers, and they're looking at the drawing that George Russell did of the interior of the bank. And all those little stars show where the bullets were. 13 bullets in like a minute, less than a minute and a half. That was shown at each one of the trials. So so without much trouble, they got a guilty verdict, and the jury came back and said hanging. So 1 down, 2 to go. Heavy Royston was the second one. Now, an interesting thing that went on in the trial there, same sort of witnesses, same sort of opening things and questions and what they're going to do, and Rogers trying to get the 2 deaths from Kansas thrown out because they were immaterial, and Hallenbeck said no, they're part of the whole process, so they ought to stay in. They decided that they wanted to take the jury down to the bank. And Rogers said, well, that's okay as long as Royston goes along. So they walked the jury down to the First National Bank along with Royston, and they went in, and Royston showing them where he stood and where Parrish was when he shot him. And they're walking around in the bank, and he said, this is only the second time I've been in here. And I have no way to prove he was not that he was there any more than that, because everything that he wrote and everything that everybody else has written said he was only there. He was only there and brought in specifically to handle Amos Newton Parrish, because they knew Amos Newton Parrish was going to be a tough cookie, because Mr. Parrish had always said, you're not going to rob my bank without a fight. And that became very true when it actually happened. And so Royston and Parrish exchanged shots. One got killed, the other one didn't, at least not till later. And here's Royston coming out of the bank. Nobody knew they were going to do this. So the pictures are all them coming back from the bank when everybody was able to catch up that, guess what, they're all down at the bank. So Royston, again, jury, guilty, death penalty. So now it's Ralph's time. Cunningham asked for an extension of a few days because he had some other business and another trial that he had to get rid of. So they gave him till the next week when the trial would start for Ralph. Once again, same witnesses, same opening, and we're going through the trial. They had the whole question about the agreement. And they had Harper get up and explain what he thought and what he knew about the agreement with everybody about not hanging Ralph, and that they'd all agreed. Well, the prosecution, as a rebuttal witness, brought in Mrs. Parrish, the mother and widow of the 2 men killed in the bank. And one of the things said was that she had been consulted about the agreement. And on the witness stand, she said they had talked to her a couple times about this might be what they have to do, but they did not specifically give her details, and it wasn't until after the agreement was made that they sat down with her and explained what the details were going to be. And she did not like it. Because, and in the long run, her answer was, if he didn't kill anybody, then I'll agree to life in prison. But if he killed somebody, he needs to hang. The defense attorney, Mr. Cunningham, did not ask her any questions. And she said, I've got a letter here. If if I need to come back because I want to say something else, I hope I can do that. She never had to come back. So they convicted Ralph, and it took a few more ballots for the jury. It took a little longer for the jury because some of them started to hold out for that we ought to go with the agreement when they first started into the jury deliberations. But within a short period of time, they came back and convicted Ralph and said for him to have a death sentence. Of course, the next thing, of course, that happens is that both sides start to get plans and prepare for appeals to the Colorado Supreme Court. This one got a little hairy because Abshire didn't have anyone on his corner, and so he didn't have any money. So he couldn't afford to pay the fees to get the transcript. Royston had a pension from his time in the Army in World War I, and some money from from the family in California. So they were able to help come up with the money to get the transcript, and then of course you had to have a fee to file with the Supreme Court. Ralph, he had the money apparently. So they go ahead and order that the transcripts be done. And the Powers County Commissioners got rather upset when they were handed a bill for about $300 for Abshire's transcript and refused to pay it. Judge Hollenbach sent an order down saying, based on state law, you will pay this bill. They kept putting it off, and they kept putting it off. They did finally have to pay the bill for the transcript. But that was because it was a situation where the county was responsible for getting the guys on trial, and because they had to appoint the attorney, Byron Rogers, that they were responsible for the transcript to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was pretty quick. Interesting, in the meantime, Abshire and Royston were being held in the jail in Pueblo, and they wrote their story out, and Rogers added some beginning and the ending information to it and sold it to a detective magazine, and it was printed, and he used part of that money for the fees for the Supreme Court. It was printed about September 1930, just before Jake died. So these guys, now they're waiting for the appeals, and the appeals are all denied by the Supreme Court by the 1st of July, 1930. So all three of the guys are in Canyon City, and they're in the death house. And the Supreme Court did one thing kind of interesting. They said Ralph has to die first. Not in the order that the trials were made, but because Ralph has to die first. And so he was the first one to go to the chamber. Interestingly, at that time, Colorado hung people, but not in the terms that you would think of, them crawling up a scaffold and being dropped. Actually, they were jerked up. That was, and that went on until 1932. They were jerked up. And in fact, the penitentiary historian has a story that the method and the mechanism was actually invented by an inmate about 1905. And so they used it to jerk them up and break their neck, so they didn't actually fall. What they had was they had a room, and they put chairs around the outside, and there was a platform. And they blindfold the guys and put their hands on them, put the noose on their neck, and then they were told to step forward. When they stepped forward, the mechanism started that changed until it dropped, and it pulled them up and broke their neck. Unfortunately, the first time they tried it, it didn't work. So they had to do it twice to kill the guy. Interestingly, in doing the research, Royston had a wife and a daughter out in California. So his body was put on a train and sent to San Andreas, California. Ralph was put on a train and sent to Garden City, Kansas, where he is buried. Abshire didn't have anybody. So Abshire is buried in Woodchuck Hill, which is, it's up on the hill above the prison, and you can look down from his grave part and see the Colorado Penitentiary there in Canyon City. It was easy once the lady helped me figure it out, is because there was a date on the one side of it and a date on the other side, and he's the only one killed in between. And Jake Fleagle, he sort of got himself caught because he wrote a letter to the governor of Colorado saying that he was going to give himself up, but that he didn't want to see Ralph get hung. But they used another trick out of the post office with a guy in California, and they tricked Jake into going to get together to do a robbery, and he got on a train in Branson, Missouri, and there were detectives on the train who were waiting for him. And when they went to get him, he tried to pull his gun out and tried to shoot. And one of those classic, you can't believe this is actually going to happen. The detective stuck his finger in the trigger guard so that Jake couldn't fire. In the meantime, the detective shot Jake in the stomach. They thought Jake was going to live at first, but they had some real problems getting him to Springfield from Branson. The first ambulance broke down, and they had trouble getting him transferred from one ambulance to the other. Sounded like they dropped him a couple of times. Anyway, they got him to Springfield, and the doctor said, I think we can save him. So all of a sudden, Colorado and California are starting, we want him extradited. We want him here. We're going to convict him. We're going to hang him. And then, of course, 2 days later, he's dead. So that started the end of that process. Ralph, Jake, Fred, his parents are in Garden City Cemetery, and his brother's family is just a few rows over. The woman who applied Gramps was the lady who was upset because she got arrested in Stockton, California. So she left Jake, and she went back to Grand Junction, and she started writing letters to sheriffs and the attorneys and Attorney General and anybody she could think of to get Jake arrested. In fact, as she called, the Fleagles didn't have a phone in their house, but they weren't too far from Friend. So if there was a call for the Fleagles, one of them had to walk up to Friend to get the phone call. Well, one of the people who got to do that was Walter's oldest daughter, Eleanor. And she told me that one of the times she went up there, it was Gramps on the phone, just chewing her out and yelling, and by God, I want to know where Jake is, and we're going to get him arrested. And she had no clue. But the family was convinced that the feds killed Jake on purpose because he had a slash on his wrist. That turns out to have actually happened in a previous robbery within a few weeks that was in Nebraska. And so, but the Fleagle family will tell you today that Jake was killed by the feds. The FBI borrowed the window from Prowers County in 1947. and put it on display in Washington, D.C. And when my grandfather took me to D.C. in 1964, we went into the FBI building downtown Washington, and there on the wall was the window and the story about the Fleagle gang and Jake's fingerprint. When they remodeled the FBI building, suddenly the window disappeared. And we didn't know, nobody knew where it was. After the trial, one of the things they did was they handed out guns to various people. The gun on the left side is the one that was given to A.C. Gordon. That's Ralph's lucky gun, which is a very cheap .38. Why it didn't misfire on him, I don't know. But then he didn't shoot it very often. I mean, he was not a... Jake was the gun expert of the brothers. The other gun had a little note with it that we finally figured out that was the gun found under the pillow on Jake's bed in Peoria, Illinois, that he left when he walked away. Frank Luther, the record in the middle is the song The Fate of the Fleagle Gang, which is a song written by Frank Luther that was popular for a period of time after the robbery. In fact, when I printed my book first in 2005, the lady who had been living up north of Cornman, way up, and then her family moved to Canarado, and so she came to my book signing in Goodland, and that lady could recite every stanza of that song except the last one, and I had that one for her, and she was about 90 at that time. All of a sudden, I got a phone call from Wendy LaPlante. At the time, we were working on the Fleagle exhibit out at the museum, and she said, "You'll never guess what I got." She got a crate, and in the crate was the window with the fingerprints still on it. What happened was when the FBI remodeled, they put it in a crate and put it in storage, and it stayed there. Well, Richardson's grandson was an FBI agent, and he found that window. And so he appropriated it, and he carried it around with him, and he was one of those guys that goes around and does FBI presentations around the country. So he carried it with him. And when he retired, he took it with him. When he found out that Wendy was doing this exhibit at the museum in Garden City, he sent it to her and told her to here it is. And so she put it on display, and it is still there, and it is on display right now in their exhibit about crimes in Garden City area, which includes the Fleagles, it includes Truman Capote and the Clutter family in Holcomb, and another one that I had never heard of that was in Garden City. The museum guy says it'll be there for probably another year, and then they don't know what they'll do with it. I've got some ideas. The 1929 Ford that Ralph Fleagle was arrested with in Kankakee, Illinois, was given back to the family after the trial. And Walter used it in egg deliveries and actually loaned it to Eleanor when she went to school, and for a while when she was a teacher. The car was out at Hooker's farm, and Hooker donated it to the museum. So far, all they've really gotten done for it is put it on blocks and put new wheels on it. It's pretty much the same condition as it was when I first saw it back there. This is Walter's daughter, Eleanor, who I had the privilege of talking to. And unfortunately, by the time I got a chance to go out and see her where she lived outside of Leote, Kansas, she'd been killed. So I spent time with her husband, and she had for years had said she would never talk about this because it was such a bad feeling and bad thing in her family's history. She came to Lamar when we were doing the centennial celebration in 1986, and that's when I first met her. And we got to talk, and I got to meet her again and talk. And she had just decided that it was time to let it all out and to get to the bottom of what she could. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to. Well, have I bored you to death? Oh, shucks. Questions?